Free will's
like
a great
who?
thing. Well, all the extremists, all the civil rights, all the kids, anybody on any extreme, on every side, that's right.
The bearded man is the poet Allen Ginsberg, one of the Beat generation of the 1950s, famous for his book Howl.
You gotta have a panoramic view to this thing. The Earth's gonna tilt a little bit, natural catastrophes are happening everywhere, all the forms are dead.
The man he is speaking with seems a bit crazy, doesn't he? You'd be surprised to know that he is the man who, to a large extent, influenced a surprisingly large portion of a generation of the 1950s, the Beat generation, and another generation in the 1960s, the hippies. I'm David Hoffman, filmmaker, and I'm proud to tell you this story because I got the chance to interview the daughter of this man. Think of the Beat generation for a moment, the Beatniks. They were writers, they were artists, they were musicians who expressed their values to the millions of Americans and others who identified with those values. This man symbolized a new way of looking at life. Some called him a genius, some called him crazy. He lived and he died as intensely as any human is capable of. His name was Neal Cassady. If you watch my videos, you know that I find every story interesting, and some stories amazing, and some individuals completely unique. Neal Cassady to me is unique, so I felt very excited when Jami Cassady, his daughter, agreed to be interviewed by me. We don't live that far apart, so I sat down with Jami and I said, Jami, we're going to talk about your dad. And she started off by telling me about her, what sounds like an ordinary life in California, but stick with this because it is an amazing story.
Okay, I was very loved. My dad worked, my mom stayed home. I have an older sister and a younger brother. My father was a funny man. It was always fun when he was around. He worked long hours though on the Southern Pacific Railroad. He'd be gone for weeks at a time sometimes, but my mom was always there. She was pretty strict. We could only watch TV one night a week. It was Mickey Mouse Club, and that was the one day in the week we could have a candy bar.
So you were kind of a, sounds like, typical 1950s family.
I felt that it was.
Typical, maybe for her, but nothing's typical about this story. I mean, Neal Cassady had 5 biographies written about him, 4 feature films, dozens of songs, thousands of articles. He was a really important character, and nothing, as you're going to find out, was ordinary about Neal Cassady.
Well, my dad was an exuberant, very intelligent, athletic, pacifist person that grew up in a horrible childhood. His mom died when he was 10, and he lived with his dad in the tenements, the slums in downtown Denver. He had to survive. He supposedly read every book in the Denver library and remembered everything. He loved cars. He liked to borrow them. By the time he was 14, he borrowed 500 cars. 18, okay. And he never crashed them up or took them forever. He would joyride, take girls to the forest or whatever, and bring the car back and leave it, you know. But
So he had girlfriends? Or he had...
Oh, well, that was one of his demons. He had a few demons, and one of them was he'd be called a sex addict today.
I guess he was a sex addict for sure. I mean, women just went nuts for him, and one of the biographers said he had to have sex 3 times a day.
So it was a big demon of his life that he tried desperately to overcome, and he just couldn't.
I saw pictures of him, and he was extremely good looking.
Yes, yeah, he was very handsome. Mom was very beautiful.
Handsome, beautiful wife, driven, very intelligent. He could quote from the Bible, he could quote from Shakespeare, and he spoke in a really strange way, which became stream of consciousness.
It's kind of an Armageddon, you know. We're gonna kill a lot of people off in the next year or 2.
Well, do you think this outfit can overflow up?
Oh, sure. Just a sort of a test period, you know, get rid of a few million here and there.
He seemed to have affected everybody who connected with him. I mean, Jack Kerouac, the great writer from the 1950s, his most famous book, On the Road, read by tens of millions of people and affecting millions. Who's he writing about? Neal Cassady, and the years he spent traveling with Neal Cassady before he wrote that book. And then in the 60s, you probably heard of the electric Kool-Aid acid test, of Ken Kesey, and of the merry pranksters, and of the bus. Extraordinary hippies, taking LSD, driving all over the country. Who drove the bus? Neal Cassady.
After all the reading he did, you know, he really wanted to be a writer. That was his aspiration. So this Hal Chase said, hey, I know some writers in New York at Columbia, let's go. So Dad went and he met Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, Bill Burroughs, Lucian Carr, blah, 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 all of them. They were all going.
How did he meet these group of very famous people?
Well, they were just students. They were just kids. You know, they were like 18 and he was a little younger. And once they met and the spark, and then this thing happened.
A spark was ignited that created a flame that caused the 50s to change. Now, I want you to look at the 50s and I want you to put aside your prejudices. If you think the 50s was the best time to live, put that aside for a minute. If you think the 50s were horrifically uptight, put that aside for a minute, because let's look at what happened. There's no doubt that a fair amount of people who lived at that time lived this new suburban, woman at home, man at work, 2 children, a dog, a refrigerator, found that boring and worse. A fair number of people, a large amount of Valium being used. It's that feeling that provoked these writers to stand against the 50s as it was being presented on television and present an alternative. And certainly to understand this period and these writers, to understand Neal Cassady, you've got to understand Jack Kerouac and On the Road.
Mom always used to say that Jack Kerouac and Neal Cassady, even though they went into Buddhism and reincarnation, you're always a Catholic altar boy. So they pictured women as whores or saints. If Dad did something that wasn't good, he could go and be absolved, say a few things, and he could do it again. You know, she said the Catholic faith has got to ruin these 2 guys.
I don't think you can look at the history of America, certainly in the 1950s, without looking at Jack Kerouac and what Neal Cassady was living.
7 instant classic, On the Road. The novel's hero was the fast-talking Zen driver Dean Moriarty, who was drawn straight from real life, from the pivotal character of the beat crowd, the charismatic Neal Cassady.
I think the book came out in 1957, and by 1958 it had sold millions of copies in the United States and around the world.
When it did hit, and it was an amazing hit, when I read it now, I don't know why, really. I mean, but everybody that comes up to Randy and I, it just changed my life. It changed my life. And they're like in awe still after all these years. And they read it when they were 18 and now they're dads and kids. And it was just the most amazing thing that happened with that book.
It feels like freedom, like a new kind of freedom.
Yes.
Would you agree with that?
Randy, jump in any time, because he was one of the ones that read it and took off.
So I knocked on the door, and I was real nervous, and Jami answered the door, and there it was this, it was all candlelit, fire going in the fireplace, Miles Davis on the stereo, and people laughing in the back room, and I went, this is it. I'm here. This is it. And that's the thing you think about these guys. They literally change your life when you read the books and decide, yeah, it's not important for me. You know, at that time when in the 50s, we're told that the man has to have a good solid job, 40 hours a week, at least 40, and buy a 3-bedroom, 2.5-bath house, have 2.5 children. And, you know, that's what everybody has to do. And I personally was just, why do I have to do that? I don't want to do that.
Live a free life. Do what you want to do. Be yourself. Speak out and live. Live for the moment. Don't just live in these contained little suburban houses. That's what they were saying, and that's what many people were identifying with.
Yeah, and that's Neal's life. Neal is always going somewhere and doing something. As soon as he gets to where he's going, he's got another place he's got to go. And that's his whole life. And to go there, not to sit around and think about it, and wouldn't it be nice to go to Mexico, but to go to Mexico, and even if you don't have any money, go, hitchhike, do what you have to do. That's, that was his whole thing, was to live your life, to be free. And
Good. It reminded me, the West.
yeah,
Dad was the West.
yeah.
Open frontier and loose, and they called him the thin-hipped cowboy and stuff, because they were all East Coast and academic and stuck living with their mothers, and here was this guy that knew everything.
Did you feel that way about him as his daughter?
Yes.
Also?
Oh yes. Oh yes. I mean, he would just come home as my dad and be funny, and he never did any of the discipline. My mind remembers a time in Los Gatos. He's sitting in a chair over here by the dining room table, and my mom had one of those paddles that you do the ball with. That was her spanking tool, and I don't know what I did, but all of a sudden she's reaching for the paddle, and she's trying to spank me. She's got one hand, and she's trying to spank me while I'm running around her in a circle. He's cracking up. He was like a friend more than, of course, a disciplinary father, like she wanted him to be.
Was he making money from being so famous?
No.
How come?
Until 1958, he worked 10 years on the Southern Pacific Railroad. He was their best conductor, and he loved that job, of course, because it was freedom. San Francisco to San Luis Obispo, overnights, when he has a girl in each port, and all that. I mean, it was a perfect job for him.
As I was interviewing Jami, I found her praise of his ability or of his character hard to believe. I mean, maybe it was because she was his daughter. But then looking on YouTube, I found this interview of Jerry Garcia, the Grateful Dead, Jerry Garcia involved with the hippies, Jerry Garcia talking about Neal Cassady.
The way his body moved, the way he looked and everything like that was just absolutely, his face is so expressive. He would go through millions of expressions, just millions of them. And just his whole body language and everything was so communicative. It was just amazing. And it was absolutely perfect. It was like a little silent movie, a silent ballet, in the morning. It lasted about maybe a minute and a half, 2 minutes, but it was perfect. His output, you know what I mean? And he felt he was the first person I met who he himself was the art. You know what I mean? He was an artist, and he was the art also. He scared a lot of people. A lot of people thought he was crazy. A lot of people were afraid of him, and most people I know didn't understand him.
Neal Cassady was familiar with jail because he got arrested lots of times when he was a teenager for stealing cars. And these guys were proposing some pretty scary stuff. Drug use, marijuana, free sexual attitude, alcohol. Somebody had to stamp down on them, the government felt, and they did.
So in 1958, he was late for work. And he was up in the city, and he hitchhiked, of course, he hitchhiked a lot back then. And two guys picked him up and took him to work. So he said, "Oh, thank you, here," and he gave him 2 joints. Well, it turns out they were undercover narcs, and they had been watching him. So he was arrested. They came to Los Gatos. I don't remember this at all, of course. I was 8. And they hauled him off to jail in San Jose. He had a trial, and the judge said, "This is ridiculous. Big deal." And bang, case dismissed. Whew. So Mom and Dad came back home. 2 days later or something, in the middle of the night, they came again and arrested him. Took him, whole new judge. This was like at midnight. Whole new judge, whole new whatever was there. Everybody was different. Prosecutor. And they sentenced him 5 to life 2 times for each joint, or 2 joints, 5 to life in San Quentin.
That's terrible.
Yeah. So it turns out later that the undercover narcs were afraid they were going to get outed. So he got out in 1960, so of course the railroad would not hire him back to Los Gatos. So we were all still living in Los Gatos. We just thought he was on a train trip. You know, we didn't, hey, Dad, you're home. I remember when he came home, I was 10 then. I had the measles, and, you know, hi, how are you, and stuff, you know. So prison was really, really painful for my mother because, A, she didn't tell us. B, he kept wanting her to sell the house. She had to drive up to San Quentin like every weekend, get a babysitter. We didn't know where she went. And it was hell for her, and I'm just shocked that none of us kids caught on.
Did that prison experience change you?
Well, it was an amazing thing, and there's actually a book that's out of print called Grace Beats Karma, and it's all his letters from San Quentin to the family.
Is it worth reading?
Oh man, when I read it, I was taking a writing class a few years ago, and the teacher said, oh, your dad was the greatest letter writer, and I'm like, you know, duh. So I got this book that had been out for quite a while, and I go to the library and read it, and it just tore me up. I mean, he was so suicidal, for one, and so mad and unhappy at himself for doing this, for getting caught on one of his demons, which was drugs and, you know, marijuana. But Mom wouldn't give in, and that made him pissed. You know, I mean, it was just a horrible time.
So the 50s was coming to an end, and Neal Cassady, just by being, apparently, put his stamp on that era. Now let's look at the 1960s. Again, put aside your prejudices of hippies, of LSD, of the electric Kool-Aid acid test, of the merry pranksters, of the bus that went across the country, and just think about that time as this guy is experiencing it.
He wanted still to be a writer. He said, I've heard of this guy, Ken Kesey, and he drove up to Perry Lane in Palo Alto and jumped out, and where's Ken? I got to meet this guy, Ken. And Ken was still at Stanford, and he was taking, the CIA was doing experiments with LSD, and they paid the students to be the guinea pigs, and they'd give him money. Well, you know, Ken loved the LSD, of course, and it was still legal. So Ken and Dad just, you know, immediate friends and stuff. And then this whole bunch of people, men and women, all had the same kind of, you know, mind, loved the LSD, crazy, they all had nicknames.
These were crazy times, wild times, and they frightened me. I was an East Coast guy. I was a working professional documentary filmmaker. I was frightened of the whole psychedelic bus thing. It scared me. It seemed crazy. And as I was working on this video, I heard stories about Jami's dad and the bus, and the way he drove that bus sounded crazy to me.
15 years after his on-the-road trips with Kerouac, Neal Cassady signed on to drive the pranksters bus further.
If you go for a drive with him, it was like the ultimate fear experience. And he like driving in San Francisco, he would go down those hills, you know, like 50 miles and 60 miles an hour, and do corners, you know, blind corners going down those hills, you know, like top speed, you know what I mean? You know, disregarding anything, and also tuning the radio maybe, and also talking to whoever else was in the car, and it never seeming to ever put his eyes on the road ever.
This is a guy that knows what he's doing, and this is his medium. It's words, it's cars, and it's drugs, but mostly it's the expansion of the consciousness.
Sir, these drugs, they're smoking something down here, sir, and it's making me awful fuzzy. Sir, I request permission to sit down.
I can remember one night we were sitting in the living room, there's a big ruckus outside, and the door bursts open, and it's the merry pranksters. They all come in, Kesey and Babs and Mountain Girl, and they all come in. It's the first time I ever saw them. And it's a party, you know, all of a sudden. I'm just sitting on the couch. So we sat on the couch, smoked a bunch of pot, drinking red wine, laughing, playing guitars, you know, just massive party. And, you know, I woke up later, about 6 hours later, and everybody's sacked out on the rug and asleep. And on the coffee table was a bag of Merry Prankster pot. So I took it, because that's the part. Back then, seeds and stems were in there too. So I could grow this Mary Prankster pot. That was the plan. But I never did, but I still have the pot.
They had the same trying to get out their mind, and of course LSD blew your mind, and it was fascinating. And you know, the Beatniks were kind of mellow. I mean, they liked wine and tea, pot, you know, and just hanging out and talking. And the hippies wanted to get out there, experiment so much to see what it was like without, you know, physical whatever.
Because he liked being on the road?
Oh, yeah, that was his, yeah, that's why they had him drive the bus, because he drove the car, the Hudson, for Kerouac, you know. He's the driver, and he had that, expulsion is the word that came, I don't even know if that's the right word, but the burst, he was bursting all the time with, he never stopped moving. I mean, I even remember that as a kid, you know, he's always doing these funny little tick things.
You might not see him for months, you know, and he would pick up exactly where he left off the last time he saw you. It was like so mind-boggling. He used to do this thing that was, this was something that killed me, and I saw him do it a lot of times. He'd take a dollar bill, you know, from anybody, you know, and take a dollar bill, and he'd put his hand on it like this, and he'd say the numbers, you know, the serial number.
She hung out at La Honda at Kesey's with the Hells Angels, and he liked sex a lot, constantly on acid and anything she could find. I mean,
and he was not a Hells Angel type.
No, complete opposite. In fact, he would break up fights in prison. That's what we found out. There'd be, you know, gangs and stuff like that, and you know, and he would somehow, with his intellect and his way, diffuse violence, which is huge. I mean, what a, you know, great gift. And he used it. He wasn't afraid to use it, even though he might get hurt. He felt that strongly about violence, even though he wanted to kill himself, you know.
Things were getting crazier and crazier. Insane high energy by Neal Cassady, doing everything to the max, and yet having a life still with his wife, Carolyn, who must have been a very strong human to put up with Neal Cassady.
She wanted it to be like the 50s. I mean, as we were speaking about the house and the lawn, she wanted Dad to be the responsible husband and father. But because of all his demons, besides sex, that was drugs, taking drugs. He didn't drink that much because his dad was such an alcoholic. But, you know, he had sex like rape. And I don't know, I can't believe Mom put up with it for so long. But she did finally say at one point, that's it, go with your other women. You know, he had girlfriends all the time. And she actually made friends with all of the girls.
Did he ever become aware of how big an effect he had, or did that never...
Well, later in life, when he was with the Mary Pranksters and Ken Kesey and lived with the Grateful Dead, yes, they idolized him for one thing. He told Mom, she goes, why do you keep doing this? Why? And he said, I feel like a dancing bear at the circus. They expect it of me. They give me whatever I want, so I do it. So yeah, I mean, yeah. He was, so, you know, 4 years later, he's dead.
I've seen half a dozen friends die, and people say, oh, they had a death wish. They did not have a death wish at all. They were wishing, in fact, for more life. It was wishing for greater life that got them in jeopardy. But he wasn't comfortable with being just who he was and stop right there. He wasn't going to back off from it, and he continued to press the edges all the way to the end.
Neal Cassady never became a writer. He never produced anything, but he did live. He died in Mexico, stoned out of his mind, died somewhere out in the valley, somewhere they found him dead. And shortly before his death, there was an interview where he was asked how he felt about his life. And he felt really badly about how he had treated his wife and his children. He felt he had let them down. I think he did. I don't know if Jami thinks he did, but you're going to hear me ask her about how this whole thing affected her, not only the way they lived it, but also in her genetic makeup. I mean, she's the genes of the famous Neal Cassady. You carry this man's personality and genes in you.
Yes.
What do you find in yourself, now we're talking to future generations,
Yeah, okay.
that carries the genetic DNA of Neal Cassady?
I'm an Aquarius, as Dad was, and we are that's a Aquarian trait, is to be the dawning of Aquarius. I mean, we want to be forward thinking, we love people, we want to make everyone happy, and you know, he just went to extremes on every level.
And you don't?
Well, I did when I was younger. I mean, Randy, after I met him, he got me off speed. You know, I mean, I was on speed when I was 14 because my mom thought I was too fat for ballet, which I did until I was 20. So all those years, she worked for this radiologist, and she would get jars, 500 Dexedrine, 2 or 3 jars under her bathroom sink, my whole high school, and they were mine.
Like vitamins?
Yeah, it was to make me lose weight. But of course, then I got hooked, and I took speed when I met him in '72. I was still on it, and he got me off it. But
How?
telling me I was better than that, and there was more in me than having to take a pill. And you know, I kind of forget because then I was an alcoholic too. Well, I was only 22, so you didn't quite think of yourself as an alcoholic. You think of yourself as 22 and, you know, like being able to drink. But I got that from him. There we go. Substance abuse, definitely. Then later, the family figured out, or Randy and I did, that my mom was an alcoholic because her dad was an alcoholic, and of course, Dad's dad was an alcoholic. So it's not my fault. But but that addictive personality, oh yeah. But
well, there's a quality in you of very American.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, and very straight shooter. Was Neal Cassady a straight shooter? I don't know. Or was
I think
fake?
It wasn't fake, but we did a thing in San Luis Obispo, and the gay group there asked me to speak about his homosexual tendencies, and
She also had?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Boy.
Oh yeah. So here's what I gave. Randy and I were trying to think, what are we going to say about this? How are we going to say it? Because we knew he was. He had sex with Allen Ginsberg, and I think his first encounter with sex was behind his dad's barbershop in Denver with some guy. You know, I mean, but he was an addict, so sex is sex. So when I was telling this group of gay people that I thought Dad was a, what's the word I used? It was the wrong word. They didn't like it. They said, no, he was an opportunist. I said he was a con man.
Yeah, that's what.
When he was a con, to get what he wanted, he'd have sex with anybody. And I was trying to point that out, and they all freaked out. And so this girl came up and she said, don't say con man, Jami, say he was an opportunist, because it just sounded better. I said, okay, I'll use that word instead.
I think, you know, he's kind of an asshole to women, and he's a con man, and he did whatever he had to do to survive. And I think Kerouac says he knew that Neal was conning him, and Neal knew that he knew that he was conning him. That Neal knew that Jack knew that he was being conned by him. So anyway, that was Neal, and I think he kept it out, you know, in the open.
That's basically.
Jami,
What do you?
what was the feeling of the last time you saw your father? I mean, the end of it.
Yes. Do you know that story? I can tell the story.
Wait, do I know that story? I don't know any
Yeah,
story.
okay.
And this is a future we're talking to.
Okay.
At a time when you and I are not here.
True.
And someone is asking about their own upbringing that comes
Yes,
from you guys.
yes, yes.
And is trying to figure themselves out.
Oh, I see.
And you're
Yeah.
describing as emotionally as you can.
Yeah.
The last time you saw this man, your
Yes.
father.
I saw him, it was in January 1968, so it was a month before he passed, and he was really in bad shape. I mean, he was hallucinating. He looked horrible, of course, just so skinny and, ravaged. We were both lying, I'm hugging him, and he's just, hallucinating and rapping, and, I can't remember what he was saying, but I was just hugging him and stuff, and then he fell asleep, and so I just left, and then, the next month we get the phone call. But when the family got the phone call in Los Gatos, we were relieved. We weren't sad, we were happy. I mean, we, mourned, of course, but relieved that he was free now, and felt much better about it than having him suffer so constantly suffering. Another thing that, go ahead. Yeah.
This is a dumb question.
No.
Are you happy that you are the daughter of Neal Cassady?
So happy. And my mom, though, don't forget her. So proud. So happy to tell everybody. And, it's not that I'm excellent or anything. It's just that I was allowed, or my reincarnation lives led me to be in this family. That's why we want to keep the legacy going. I mean, it's just the 40s and the 50s and the 60s that Dad traveled through and influenced so much is something I think we need today, too. It's like a legacy that should be kept alive of the intellect and the love. Hippies are all love, but it's a basic thing that I think my dad exemplified overboard, which made everybody look up to him and follow him and agree with the way he was and love him. Randy and I do our events and shows. Every single person says all they remember is his good qualities, his kindness, his gentle soul, his nonviolence. Not one person ever said anything bad about him. And that's what they remember from years and years ago. And it just, oh man, does that make me feel good.
I want to thank you for this hour. You just spent an hour.
Oh, I have lots more stories.
I feel really helps people in the future understand this time, your unique family, mother and father.
Yes.
And it doesn't seem to have done enormous damage, maybe because of Randy, to you.
Yeah. Thank you.